Recreating the Skeld in Minecraft. What am I doing in my life? So exactly how do we replicate the Skeld in Minecraft? Well, I know the answer. We copy everything. Okay, that's not the true answer, but it's close enough to the actual reason. We have to replicate as much as we can, and if we stumble into any problems, we have to improvise. Just like the shape I used for this entire Among Us map. Some of the rooms are smaller than they are in the Among Us counterpart. And now, since we're done with the entire Among Us map shape, let's move on to the first room, the cafeteria. And I mean, who wouldn't start with the cafeteria? It's where you call an emergency meeting, it's where you spawn in. It's iconic, and it was pretty easy to make too. Just a couple of tables, a nice floor, some custom textures on the walls, and we are done. I don't think it's the best cafeteria in the world, but I think it gets the job done. Next up, we have admin, and the reason why I did the second is because it was right next to cafeteria, and it's pretty iconic for how frustrating it is. I mean, swipe card is absolute torture. But no matter how frustrating it is, I still built admin, and surprisingly, it was one of the easier maps to build. Time for the second biggest room in the Skeld, storage. It was actually pretty difficult to recreate it in Minecraft just because of how big it was and because of the floor. In the end, I did complete it, but it was quite tedious and I wouldn't say it was totally worth it. But next up, we have two rooms that are on the right side of the Skeld. This includes weapons and navigation. For weapons, it was actually pretty straightforward. The tasks were very easy. The walls, the floor, the roof were all just straightforward. This was just a simple map and there's nothing really crazy to say. But for navigation, it was also pretty easy. But I did use my own custom block for it, and I may have gone a little overboard and covered almost the entire room with it, but I think the texture looks pretty good, honestly. Is it just me? Next up, we have O2. Definitely one of the more forgettable maps, at least for me. I was a little bit skeptical on the interior for this because there's like this tube with water in it and it didn't really look good in my opinion, but I had to replicate it. So I did, and in the end, I guess it kind of reminds you of oxygen. It just looks a bit too different. And here we are, the map you guys probably like the most, electrical. For this room, I had to improvise quite a bit. The block selection was pretty tedious, so I ended up making a new block. And the walls, the floor, the tasks, as usual, pretty simple. But when it came to the wires on the floor, I had to improvise and use redstone instead. Now time for maps that mainly lie on the left. The reactor, security, and lower engine. For lower engine, this was actually one of the harder maps. This was due to the block selection and because of the engine, which is the main focus of the room. I spent quite a lot of times on the proportions for the engine, but in the end, I came up with something that was pretty similar to the original with a little bit of the blue windows on the engine. I have no idea what it is. For reactor, you probably think it's like your average map to create. Well, surprisingly, it was the hardest map to make. The main focus of the reactor, which is the reactor, was quite tedious surprisingly. I kept trying to think of block selections and argue with my friend about it. It was all a giant mess. But in the end, I think I made quite a good reactor. And next we have security, which was one of the more easier maps because it's the smallest one. But I did end up changing the block palette quite a bit due to a lot of blocks in Minecraft not looking like any of the blocks in security. So the block selection changed a lot. Now for this segment, the maps are totally random. So to start off this segment, let's talk about Medbay. This room wasn't the hardest, but it definitely was slightly over average when it comes to difficulty. I had a little bit of a hard time when it came to the block palette for the walls because again, we don't have enough blocks in Minecraft that reflect the color scheme of the original. And the next random map we have is weapons, one that I almost forgot to cover. This one was pretty typical. It's just an average map. It's not the biggest, it's not the smallest, but I did change things up, like the wires on the floor, or are they even wires? I think I consider them as pipes. But no matter what, I used no new blocks for this one because the color scheme's pretty basic, but I did go with a good sandstone kind of color. And for our final random map, we have Comms, my least favorite map. I know, I just find it a tiny bit basic for my taste, but of course it isn't a bad map, it's just my personal opinion. But whatever the criticisms, I'm still gonna build it. A couple of computers, a nice floor, a nice roof, some walls, we're done. And now it's time for the final map, Upper Engine. I started by making the floor, then making a hole for the engine. I started making the walls and some essential details for the entire room. I started development on the engine, which took quite a while, surprisingly. I started detailing the engine and the area around the engine and did the roof. And once that was done, all of the rooms were done, making the Skeld map.